Super Mario as a video game franchise has reached astronomical levels of popularity over its nearly 40-year tenure as Nintendo's flagship series. And of the many games within the series, I think there's little doubt that the most popular and most anticipated Super Mario games are those that fall into the 3D platformer genre. Games like Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Odyssey are often heralded as games that were true masterpieces and defined the generation of video gaming. But, as is the case with many a game, depending on where you live in the world and what language you speak, the experience you had playing one of these 3D Mario games most likely differed in some way to what was originally created by the developers at Nintendo of Japan. This difference is due to what is known as localization, or the process of changing media, in this case a game, to suit a target culture. And if you've watched any of my previous videos on localization, you know that in my opinion, localization comes in many different shapes, sizes, and colors. Sometimes things are changed just enough to make a specific game understandable to a specific audience, and sometimes the name Teresa gets changed to Boo Diddley. These localization changes that go beyond what is necessary for comprehension by the player and enter the realm of opinion-based change are what I like to call over-localization. And, like most games that have been subject to localization over the years, the 3D Super Mario games have seen their fair share of over-localization, which is what we're here to talk about today. In a similar style to the first video in this series, I'm going to go through each 3D game in the Super Mario series and point out some instances of over-localization in things like character, level, and enemy names. And first up on the list, as you might have guessed, is the first 3D Mario game, Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 was a game that revolutionized gameplay by bringing us into the third dimension. But one thing that carried over from previous Super Mario games was the level to which the game was over-localized. Let's start by talking about some of the enemies here. And when it comes to Mario 64 enemies, one of the scariest and most memorable for kids who played the game around the time of release was most definitely the eel guy from Jolly Roger Bay. In the original Japanese release of the game, this enemy is known as Utsubo, which literally translates into English as moray eel. However, when Mario 64 was localized into English, Utsubo's name was changed to Unagi. Unagi is the word for freshwater eel in Japanese, and is probably the most commonly known Japanese word for eel by English speakers. This is most likely due to the fact that unagi is very widely used in Japanese cuisine. However, Utsubo isn't a freshwater eel. He's a moray eel, which typically live in salt water. Presumably, the switch in name was done to make it more familiar to a Western audience, but the biggest question I have is, if you were going to change the name anyway, why change it to a word that is also Japanese? If you were going to use another Japanese word anyway, why not just leave the name as Utsubo? It seems like a fine name to me, and would at least preserve the creativity of the developers. If you wanted to make the name more familiar to English speakers, you could have just made it something like moray, so we'd at least know what type of eel this was and could then connect it directly back to the original name, but instead the localizers chose the path of confusing everyone with a different Japanese name. Definitely not the localization philosophy for me. And apparently Nintendo agreed because in Mario Odyssey, Unagi's name was changed to Moray, an obvious pun on Maw and Moray. It's not perfect, but it's way better than Unagi. Another rather iconic enemy from Super Mario 64, probably because of how annoying he was, is the vulture that can be found in Shifting Sandland. In Japanese, his name is Django. I honestly have no idea why he has this name. Maybe the developers just thought it sounded cool, which is a perfectly fine reason for a name. However, even though the name Django is completely understandable by a Western audience, it was nevertheless changed when the game was localized into English. Instead of Django, we got Klepto. This obviously comes from the word kleptomaniac, referring to how he steals Mario's hat. But was this change necessary? No, absolutely not. I'm sure the name Django would have been very easily accepted by the players and the community as a whole, but we got Klepto. Moving on now to an enemy whose localization is very similar to that of Unagi, but with a few key differences. That enemy is Sushi the Shark. In Japanese, they are referred to as Hojiro, a reference to the Hohojiro Zame, or Great White Shark. Obviously, once again, the name was changed to another different Japanese word for no apparent reason, but the name chosen in this case is particularly egregious in my opinion. In Japan, shark sushi is not a thing. Sure, you could probably find it if you looked hard enough, but it's by no means a normal variant of sushi. In fact, I'd go as far as to say the typical Japanese person would be very surprised to even see shark sushi. Sharks are used in a variety of other Japanese dishes, but sushi is not one I'd say would be considered mainstream at all. I understand why the name was chosen. A shark is a big fish, and it's funny to name one sushi, but there's many other names that would have been just as good and made much more sense. But characters aren't the only thing that face the wrath of Nintendo's localizers when it comes to Mario 64. We also have many course names that were changed on a whim. In what is the opposite of what we saw with Unagi and Sushi, Lethal Lava Land was a name that was changed from a different English name. The Japanese name for Lethal Lava Land is literally Fire Bubble Land. Sure, I'll admit it does sound a little lame, but that doesn't mean it needed to be changed. Fire Bubble Land is a perfectly understandable name to a Western audience. It makes a good deal of sense. Lava bubbles and causes fire. There you go. Now, I'll be the first to say Lethal Lava Land is a great name. You've got the alliteration in there, and the name just sounds really cool. But the point I'm trying to make with these videos isn't that over-localization causes bad results. That's not true at all. What I am trying to illustrate to you is the fact that these changes are not necessary and are very often extremely arbitrary. Sure, the name Lethal Lava Land is good, but can you say with confidence you would have hated the name Fire Bubble Land? I know I can't. And while that's not the best example, I think it at least gets my point across. One other level I'd like to mention before we move on to our next game is Dire Dire Docks. The Japanese name for this stage is very simple. It's just Water Land. Straight and to the point. It also falls in line with the other courses that use land in their name, like Fire Bubble Land. But in English, they went the other way with it and made it line up with courses like Cool Cool Mountain. It's another weird change that I don't think needed to be made, but I guess someone at Nintendo thought otherwise. I'm realizing now I probably could have made a video just talking about the localization of Mario 64, but it's too late. We're moving on to Sunshine. Super Mario Sunshine was the first Mario game to feature voice acting in any major capacity, but weirdly enough, the translation is actually really close to the original. Maybe that's because they translated the English dialogue into Japanese subtitles this time around, but I guess we'll never know for sure. But since there really isn't much to talk about in terms of dialogue, we'll just focus on what we've been looking at up until now, the names. And unlike Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine had the names of some main characters changed when going through localization into English. Let's start out with Mario's companion in this game, Flood. In English, Flood's name is extremely convoluted, being not only an acronym for Flash Liquidizer Ultra Dousing Device, but also a reference to the actual word flood. It's such a complicated and overly intensive name that you might think there's no possible way this could be a localization, but you'd be wrong. Flood's original Japanese name is just Pump. It's not an acronym for anything, and it doesn't have any hidden meaning. It's just Pump, like something you'd use to spray water. It's an extremely simple and well-fitting name, but for some reason it was over-localized into Oblivion. If I had to take a wild guess, I'd say this was a byproduct of a certain American mentality very common in the early 2000s. That is that over-the-top and extremely complicated things are really cool. It was thought that giving something, especially some kind of technology, a really complicated name would make kids think that was rad, which to some degree is true, but it still doesn't warrant this level of unnecessary change. Sticking with main characters, let's talk about the Pianta. This one's a little bit involved. So the Japanese name for Pianta is Monte, which is the Italian word for mountain. This was probably chosen based on the resemblance the characters bear to the image of a mountain. Now, not only does this not make much sense because the Pianta live on a tropical island, which aren't typically associated with mountains, but the name bears a great similarity to Monty Mole's name that was also over-localized in case you were wondering. So, of course, it was changed. The name chosen for the English release of the game, Pianta, is the Italian word for plant. It's weird to me that both the English and Japanese names were taken from Italian, a language that is not tropical in any way, and on top of that, both the names chosen don't make much sense for the character. This is even further reinforced by the name being localized to something completely different for the Italian version of the game. In Italian, the Pianta are known as Palmense, which comes from palma, meaning palm tree. Now, that's a name that makes sense. It's still an over-localization, for sure, but at least it's a fitting name. Alright, now let's talk about the actual setting of the game, Isle Delfino. In Japanese, Isle Delfino is known as Dolphic Island. This is most likely a combination of the words dolphin and tropic. But, much like with the Pianta, the English name was taken from Italian and doesn't match up with the actual Italian name. Delfino is Italian for dolphin, but it seems when used as a name for an island it should be Delfina, as the Italian name is Isola Delfina. In all honesty, it's not the biggest issue, but it could have been completely avoided by simply keeping the original name. Now let's talk enemies. And the first enemy I'd like to talk about is my personal favorite enemy from Mario Sunshine, Petey Piranha. In Japanese, he's known as Bossu Pakkun, or Boss Pakkun. If you didn't know, Piranha Plant's original name is Pakkun Furawa. pakun being a Japanese onomatopoeia for biting or eating something. So in reality, there's two levels of overlocalization at work here. One odd thing I found when looking at the characters from this game is that the bosses mostly just use the word boss followed by the base enemy they represent's name, like Boss Pakun or Boss Gesso. It's extremely straightforward, and that's probably why it was changed. Like I've been saying, English localizers tend to err on the side of too much change when it comes to names. I mean, they straight up added a real name to Petey Piranha, which defined his character for a lot of people, even though that wasn't the original intention. Now, I love the name Petey Piranha, I think it really makes him a lovable character, but that still doesn't justify the change in my opinion. But okay, let's look at one more example of an enemy that had its name over-localized. And in this case, it's a base enemy, Strollin' Stew. With a name like Strollin' Stew, I think it's pretty clear that there's a good deal of over-localization going on here, and that is without a doubt the case. Strollin' Stew's Japanese name is Kudin, which comes from the word kudi meaning chestnut. This is also a reference to Goomba's Japanese name Kudibo, given to him for his resemblance to the nut. So not only did they break the connection between Strollin' Stew and Goomba, but they also gave him a name that actually has nothing to do with anything. I mean, Strollin' I get, but Stew? Just why? His Japanese name wasn't anything close to a real name, so why give him one in English? It's a mystery. Next up, we've got the original Super Mario Galaxy. And just like all the other Super Mario games that came before, Galaxy went through quite a bit of localization. First things first, we gotta talk about the main characters. Rosalina, as she's known to the English-speaking world, actually has a different Japanese name that makes a lot more sense in my opinion. In Japan, she's known as Rosetta. This is a reference to a specific type of orbit known as a Rosetta orbit. This orbital pattern occurs when an object enters orbit with a black hole, with a velocity not fast enough to escape and not slow enough to be swallowed up. It's quite the interesting phenomenon. Now, what about Rosalina? Surely if the original name had a deep astrological meaning, the localization will as well, right? Nope. At least as far as I can tell. They just picked the name because they thought it sounded good. This is one of those localization changes that honestly blows my mind. Rosetta is a fine name that any English speaker can understand, and it also has a deep connection to astronomy, so what was the thought process here? It feels like we're back in the 80s when localizers would just change names for no reason other than they just wanted to. It's Princess Toadstool all over again. Next up, we've got Luma, and honestly things aren't nearly as bad as with Rosalina. Luma's Japanese name is Chico. There isn't a concrete answer on where this name comes from, but it may come from the childish way of saying Hoshinoko or Child of the Stars, which is Hochinoko. There is also a possible connection to the astronomer known as Tycho Brahe, as if the name was transliterated into Japanese, it would become Chico. Now I'll admit, this is an extremely convoluted etymology, and the English localization does make things much simpler. Luma, as you might have guessed, comes from the Latin lumen, meaning light. Pretty straightforward, right? It feels like we've gone in the complete opposite direction of the earlier Super Mario games where the English localizers would overcomplicate everything by changing simple names to really specific and involved ones. It's overlocalization without a doubt, but I do appreciate the simplicity here. But now let's talk enemies. As usual, I've picked a few specific name changes that I find particularly interesting. First, let's take a look at Spoing. Their English name most likely comes from spider and spring, or spider and boing, like a sound for bouncing. It's not perfect, but it's actually pretty close. Spoing's Japanese name is Bane Gumo, Bane meaning spring, and Gumo coming from Kumo or spider. Spoing is a fine name, but I think something like Springer or Spring Spider would have been a closer and more accurate localization that would still be understandable to an English-speaking audience. And last but not least, we've got Mandibug. This is another weird one, so buckle up. Now, the English name is pretty easy to understand, right? It's just a combination of mandible or jaw and bug. It's when we get into the original Japanese name that things get a bit messy. That original name is Kua Kabuto. This comes from the names of two different bugs in Japanese, the Kuagata, or stag beetle, and the Kabuto Mushi, or rhinoceros beetle. Now, as for the reason this name was changed, well, as far as I can tell, it's because Western kids don't have the same love for beetles that Japanese kids do. It's a common pastime in Japan to go bug hunting, with stag beetles and rhinoceros beetles being among the most popular. So, to a typical Japanese kid, the name Kua Kabuto would immediately bring up the image of those bugs, and they'd completely understand what's going on here. However, the same can't be said for Westerners. I know I didn't know what those bugs were until I got older and started looking into Japanese culture, so it does make sense that the name was changed during localization. However, the question is, would a child know what a mandible is? I don't think so, so that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the change. Something like rhino stag would have accomplished the same thing and remained true to the original in my opinion. And the next game up on the list is Super Mario Odyssey. I won't be looking at Galaxy 2 in this video because there's just too much overlap with Galaxy, and we're already getting up there in terms of time, but maybe I'll come back to it someday. So, as I've said before, Nintendo has gotten much better when it comes to over-localization in recent years, and Super Mario Odyssey is a great example of that. Of the main cast of characters, there really isn't much to talk about. The Broodals all have the same name as the original, Cappy retains his name, the Odyssey is just the Odyssey. It's honestly great to see. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we're free of over-localization, but I would like to commend Nintendo for a job well done. As for the over-localizations, some of the main culprits here are the locations. The kingdom names overall are pretty good, but there's one in particular that's not so great in my opinion, and it didn't have to be. That is the Luncheon Kingdom. In Japanese, it is known simply as the Ryori no Kuni, or Cooking Kingdom or Food Kingdom. Both of these names would have been fine and fit with the theme of the other kingdom names that were pretty much translated word for word, but sadly we had to get at least one over-localized name here. I get that it's the Food Kingdom, but you didn't have to spice things up so much. Sorry. But that's not the worst of it. The actual towns and cities within the kingdoms are where things really go off the rails. Let's just marathon these real quick. Bonneton in the Cap Kingdom is really Kabudon, which comes from kabudu, or to put on a hat. Fossil Falls is really Dyna Falls, which is a pretty self-explanatory and very arbitrary change. Tostarina is Achi-nya in Japanese, coming from Achi or Atsui, meaning hot, and nya, the Japanese cat meow, referencing the taxi cat guys. Lake Lamode is Doreshi Bare, most likely coming from dress, because the wedding dress is from here, sea, like the ocean, and ballet. Steam Gardens is actually Steam Garden, so that's obviously the worst one yet. Nimbus Arena is Grandomoku. This one's a little weird, but my guess is that it comes from grand and moku moku, the onomatopoeia for billowing or clouds forming. Forgotten Island is Rosuto. This is a Japanese pun on the word rosto, or lost, and to, meaning island, so it makes sense that this one was changed. New Donk City is exactly the same, which is cool. Shiveria was changed from Powda Boru, or powder bowl. Pretty obvious connection to snow there. Bubbling is Shua Shuana in Japanese, which comes from Shua Shua, which is once again an onomatopoeia, this time for bubbling or foaming. Mount Valbono is pretty much the same, the only difference is that they added the mount. The Japanese is just Borubono. Crumbledon is Horobia from the Japanese Horobiru, or to go to ruin or be destroyed. Bowser's Castle is Koopajo, or Koopa Castle, as you might have expected. And Honeyloon Ridge is Honey Kureta, or Honey Crater. Pretty close, but still over-localized. So clearly the location names bared the brunt of the over-localization, and in a lot of cases for little to no reason. Some names did have to be changed to be understandable to a Western audience, but overall I'd say this is a pretty egregious amount of over-localization. Most of the names that were changed were done so just because the localizers wanted to change them, which I'm sure you know by now, I just can't agree with. It's really cool that we got a lot of main characters that retain their names, along with the majority of the kingdoms being unchanged, but this is still a lot of over-localization. And sadly, the same can be said for a lot of the enemies in Super Mario Odyssey. My favorite example is Cenobi, or Uproot. Cenobi comes from Cenobi in Japanese, which is when you try to make yourself seem taller by either standing on your tiptoes or stretching out your back. It can also be used in a metaphorical sense to mean to stretch oneself out or to reach higher. This name was given to Uproot for the obvious reason that he stretches his legs out really far and walks on what could be called his tiptoes when you move. It's a pretty straightforward name. Uproot also makes sense, but it loses that same tippy-toe connotation that the original name had, and that's a shame in my opinion. Another example of enemy over-localization is the Moai. The English name probably comes from the Moai statues, as well as the name Mo and the word I. It's a pretty good name, I'm not doubting that, but it is very different from the Japanese. The Japanese name for the Moai is Miruzo. This comes from the term Miruzo, a way to say to look or see, and zo, meaning statue. Obviously, the pun makes no sense in English, but there was definitely a way to preserve the original name more closely than what we got. Just off the top of my head, see-tachu is something that would have remained closer to the original and still made sense to an English speaker. And of course, there are many, many more examples of over-localization in not just Super Mario Odyssey, but all the games we looked at here today. However, I think that's where we'll leave it for now. Honestly, I really like making videos about localization, but I think from now on I'll try focusing on just one game or topic per video as opposed to going over a bunch in a row like I did here. That way we can go more in depth with each game and probably reduce the time of each individual video a bit. At least that's what I hope to do. The next series I'm planning to take a look at is Pokemon, because that seems like a goldmine of interesting over-localization choices, and when I do make those videos I'll be going one generation at a time. I'm not sure when that'll be out because I may have to play through the games a few times to give you guys the whole picture, but definitely look forward to it. Also, I did take a week off last week for various reasons, but we should be back on track starting from this week. If you made it this far in the video, thanks so much, it always means a lot. And if you did enjoy what you saw and heard here today, consider giving the video a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. You get it? It's see-tachu, like see-statue, like statue, but see-tachu. Like the word see, where you're seeing something, and then a statue, like see-tachu. You get it?